Good day everyone! We are the Group 5 and today we are going to discuss about antimicrobial agents. But before we begin, my name is Ailey Abangon, the first reporter to be followed by Francine Nicole Araujo, Mickey Jasmine Lanuza, and Princess Lalican, and with the support of Alicia Lopez, Francine Grino, Angela Francisco, James Calado, Marie Jomel Gregorio, and Shelly Hina. Antimicrobials, also known as antibiotics, are drugs that were produced from microorganisms or synthetically with the purpose of inhibiting and destroying microorganisms even at low concentrations. The natural sources include fungi and bacteria. So when we say antimicrobial agents, these agents are designed to either kill the target bacteria, bactericidal, or stops their growth, bacteriostatic. For example, antibiotics are used against bacteria, and antifungals are used against fungi. Another example, antibiotics penicillin extracted from fungus Penicillium. Polymyxin and bacitracin developed from the bacterium Bacillus subtilis. Tetracycline, chloramphenicol, and streptomycin drugs from Actinomyces. Next, antibiotics are mostly used to treat an infectious disease. Here are the characteristics of an ideal antimicrobial agent. First, it should be able to kill the microbial agent or inhibit its growth. Second, it must have a broad spectrum of activity. Third, it should not cause any damage or adverse effect to the patient. Fourth, it should remain stable when stored in either a solid or a liquid form. Fifth, it should be able to remain in specific body tissues long enough for it to be effective. Sixth, it should be able to kill the organism or inhibit its growth before it has had a chance to mutate and develop resistance. Seventh, it must exhibit selective toxicity. It must be toxic to the microbial cell but not to the host cells. Types of antibiotic. Antibiotics may be classified in several ways based on spectrum of activity. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, those with a wide coverage of activity against a wide spectrum of microorganisms. Example, amoxicillin and ampicillin. Broad-spectrum antibiotics are effective both gram-positive bacteria and gram-negative bacteria. Second, narrow-spectrum antibiotics, those with a limited coverage of activity, effective only against a limited number of microorganisms. Example, penicillin G. Antibiotics can be classified in several ways based on antimicrobial activity. Bactericidal antibiotic, more preferred antibiotic than bacteriostatic. It has the ability to directly kill bacteria. Examples, penicillin, nitrofurantoin, fluoroquintonils. Second, bacteriostatic antibiotic can only stop or inhibit the bacteria from growing. Examples, macrolides, clindamycin, and nofobiusin. Antibiotic based on their absorbability. Antibiotics are based on their absorbability from the site of administration. A locally acting antibiotic is one that limits its action at the site where it is administered. Examples, topical agents such as topical ointments or eye drops. It is a systematically acting antibiotic is one that affects several body systems. Example, antibiotics that are administered intramuscularly or intravenously. Bactericidal agents are more preferred than bacteriostatic because of its ability to kill the bacteria. So the next reporter is Francine Araujo.
Thank you, Ms. Abangon. Now let's move on to different classifications of antibiotics. So there are different classifications of antibiotics according to their mechanism of action. So the first one is the agents that interfere with the synthesis to mechanism cell wall. The agents act by inhibiting the different stages of peptidoglycan synthesis, or by destroying the already formed peptidoglycan by activating autolytic enzymes. The B-lactam or the beta-lactam antibiotics are most commonly used as an exemplified by penicillins and cephalosporins, which is also called as penicillin-binding proteins or PBPs. They act by inhibiting the conversion of immature peptidoglycan to mature peptidoglycan by directly inhibiting bacterial transpeptidase. The peptidoglycan produced is weakly cross-linked, making the organism susceptible to cell lysis and death. And another class of cell wall synthesis inhibitor is the glycopeptides. Glycopeptides is a class of antibiotics discovered in plant and soil bacteria that contain a glycosylated silic or polycyclic non-ribosomal peptide. An example of this is the vancomycin, which is used to treat a number of bacterial infections. Members of this class inhibit the transglycosylase and transpeptidase enzymes that are essential for the completion of the synthesis of the peptidoglycan component of the bacterial cell wall. So the next one is the agents that alter the function or permeability of the cell membrane. The microbial cell membrane is essential to the survival of the organism because not only does it serve as a barrier by its selective permeability, but more importantly, it is the site of the bacterial adenosine triphosphate production or ATP. Agents that target the cell membrane can be classified into cationic, anionic, and neutral agents. The most well-known are polymyxin B and cholistomethate or polymyxin E, which are cationic agents. These agents initially act by disrupting the outer membrane structure, enabling them to enter the cell and inhibit metabolic processes in the bacterial cell. Among the damaging effects of polymyxin B are: first is the disturbance of the surface charge and lipid composition of the cell membrane, disruption of the potassium gradient on the cell membrane, and lastly is the polarization of the cell membrane. Antifungal drugs such as polyenes alter the permeability of the cell membrane. An example of polyene is the nystatin, which is an antifungal medicine that kills the fungus and treats the infection, and amphotericin B is an antifungal medication used for serious fungal infections and leishmaniasis. Azoles like clotrimazole, ketoconazole, miconazole, and fluconazole are another group of antifungal drugs that interfere with the synthesis of ergosterol, which is a major component of the fungal cell membrane. So the third classification of antibiotics is the agents that inhibit protein synthesis. These agents bind with the ribosomes, either the 30S or the 50S ribosomal unit, or both. Binding with the ribosome results in failure to initiate the synthesis of proteins. Interference with protein elongation or misreading will be resulting to deformed proteins. And inhibitors of the 30S ribosomal subunit interfere primarily with the initiation process. The representative drugs are the aminoglycosides and tetracycline. Aminoglycosides cause formation of non-functional complexes and misreading. Similarly, tetracycline also targets bacterial 30S of ribosomal subunit. Spectinomycin is an antimicrobial agent that is related to the aminoglycosides that binds to a protein in 30S ribosomes, which is different from the target of the aminoglycosides. Spectinomycin and tetracycline are only bacteriostatic but inhibit a wide variety of bacteria, including chlamydia and mycoplasma. So agents that bind to the 50S ribosomal subunit are inhibitors of the elongation process of protein synthesis. Three classes of drugs under this are chloramphenicol, which acts by binding to a peptidyl transferase enzyme, thereby inhibiting peptide bond formation. It is a bacteriostatic agent that is effective against a number of gram-negative organisms. The next one is macrolides. It also acts on peptidyl transferase enzymes by interfering with its reaction or translocation. The most popular macrolide is erythromycin, which can effectively inhibit gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria including Haemophilus, Mycoplasma, Chlamydia, and Legionella. New classes of macrolides are azithromycin and clarithromycin, which may have broader spectrums of activity than erythromycin. And lastly is the linosinoids. The most important among linosinoids or lincosamides is clindamycin. It has a similar target as macrolides, and like macrolides, it is only bacteriostatic. Agents that bind with bond 30S and 50S ribosomal subunits include gentamicin and kanamycin. So the fourth classification of antibiotics is the agents that act on the nucleic acid. So here, we have agents that inhibit both DNA and RNA. So the first one is the agents that inhibit DNA topoisomerase. Topoisomerase enzymes types 1 and 2 are essential to DNA synthesis and are critical enzymes involved in protein translation and self-replication. DNA gyrase, a type 2 typoisomerase, is found only in prokaryotic organisms and is essential for their survival. Among the different antimicrobial agents, quinolones have been found to the most effective against DNA gyrase. First generation quinolones include nalidixic acid and oxalinic acid. Newer generation of quinolones include the fluoroquinolones, which have wider spectrum of activity than the quinolones. And the next one is the agents that inhibit RNA synthesis. Agents that act by interfering with the B subunit or the beta subunit of an RNA polymerase that is needed for RNA synthesis. Rifampicin is a first-line drug used for the treatment of tuberculosis that specifically inhibits bacterial RNA synthesis. So the last but not the least in the classification of the antibiotic agents is the agents that inhibit metabolic pathways. So these agents interfere with metabolic pathways that is crucial for the survival of the microorganisms. Trimethoprim and sulfonamides are antibiotics that interfere with folic acid metabolism. So they act as a competitive inhibitor of tetrahydrofolic acid, which is important in the synthesis of DNA, RNA, and bacterial cell wall proteins. Bacteria cannot utilize folic acid from the environment and thus must synthesize their own. Sulfonamides act specifically by inhibiting formation and dihydrofolic acid. Trimethoprim inhibits formation of tetrahydrofolic acid by inhibiting the enzyme dihydrofolate reductase. So now, let me call on Miss Miki Alanuza for the mechanism of drug resistance.
Okay, mechanisms of a drug resistance. Drug resistance is a growing concern in the field of infection control. Development of resistance may either be innate, intrinsic, or acquired. So kapag sinabi natin drug resistance, siya yung nagko-control sa infection. So para ma-prevent din yung pagkalat ng bacteria sa ating katawan. Intrinsic resistance, stable genetic property encoded in the chromosomes of the organisms and shared by all strain of the species. Okay, so while acquired resistance, resistance arising from the ability of the organism to receive an antimicrobial drug to which of the species as a whole is naturally susceptible, not normally encoded in the chromosomes of organisms. So, para mas maintindihan natin kung ano yung pinagkaiba nila, ang intrinsic resistance, kumbaga siya yung nagkakaroon ng power or siya yung may power para malabanan yung pathogen. While yung acquired resistance, sa pamamagitan niya, doon nagta-transfer yung genetic material. Okay? Next slide. Mechanisms of drug resistance. several factors that contribute to the development of the antimicrobial resistance of the organisms. So first, most common is the overuse of broad-spectrum antibiotics due to overprescription. So kapag sinabi nating overuse, tayong mga Pilipino, mahilig tayong uminom ng gamot kapag may naramdaman lang tayo. Pero dito, ang pag sa antibiotic, dapat may prescription siya ng mga doktor bago siya inumin. Isa yon sa nagiging factors ng pag-overuse or uh, pagdaas ng dosage sa katawan natin kasi nakakainom tayo ng antibiotic na hindi naman prescription ng doktor. Then next is B. Other factors include incorrect diagnosis. So isa rin yon. Kapag mali yung naging diagnose sa atin, then uminom tayo or nakainom tayo ng antibiotic. So isa yun sa nagiging factor. And lastly, C. Unnecessary prescription of antibiotics, indiscriminate or improper use of antibiotics by the patient. So, improper use, yung mali natin pag-inom or paggamit ng antibiotics. Next slide. Mechanisms of the drug resistance. Resistance acquired through genetics exchange can be occurred through any of three ways. You have three ways. First is a transformation, simplest and easiest form of the genetics exchange studies. In a transformation, naked or free microbial DNA inserts itself into DNA of the same species. So, kapag sinabi natin transformation, ito yung simplest and easy way. Okay? Next naman is transduction. The transfer of the genetic materials by the bacteriophage. Okay, kapag sinabing bacteriophage, bacteriophage, ano ba ibig sabihin nun? Or ano yung function nun? In bacteriophage is a type of virus that infects bacteria. In fact, the word bacteriophage, the word bacterio, it means bacteria eater because bacteriophage destroyed their host cells. The bacteriophage are the composed of the nucleic acid molecules that is surrounded by a protein structure. Ayun naman ang transduction. While conjugation, the transfer of genetic materials through the sex pilus. What is the transfer to another bacterium is an extra chromosomal DNA called plasmid. Kapag sinabi natin sex pilus, so they are termed as sex pili as they facilitate gene transfer and recombination in the bacterial cells. It is a primitive mode of sexual reproduction in bacteria. So, kailangan ng sexual interaction dito. Kaya tinawag siyang sex pili. Okay? Preparatory to the transfer of the DNA form to male to female. Ayun naman yung conjugation. So, next is next slide. Drug modification or inactivation. Certain resistant genes may affect the activity of an antibiotic in two ways. You have two ways. First, resistance genes may code for enzymes that can alter its chemical structure, leading to the inactivation of the antibiotic, or the product of the resistance genes may cause hydrolysis hydrolysis of the antibiotics, thereby destroying the antibiotics. Okay. For example, here, certain bacteria um, produce beta-lactamase, which can be hydrolyzed the beta-lactam bonds in the chemical structure of the antimicrobial agent. So, this is the most common mechanism of the beta-lactam resistance, and is the mechanisms involved in the resistance of the certain microorganism to penicillin. Okay po. Next slide. Prevention of cellular uptake of efflux. First, gram-negative bacteria develop the ability to change the lipid composition of their outer membrane, thereby preventing the antibiotic from reaching its cellular target, and this prevents their accumulation in the bacteria cell. So, para mas maintindihan natin, in short, siya yung pumipigil um, um, sa mga bacteria cells para hindi na siya kumalat or para ma-prevent na din yung pagkalat ng bacteria. Next slide. In addition, there are gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria that have developed an efflux plum that can prevent the antibiotic from accumulating within the bacteria cell. Okay? So, next is efflux plums, effective against the wide range of the antimicrobial in a multiple cases. We have a multiple cases of efflux plums. So, siya yung may effect or malaki yung effect sa na hindi na kumalat yung antimicrobial. Okay po. Next slide. Modification to target site. Any change in a structure of this target structures will lead to the inability of the antibiotic to exert its action on the target bacteria. Certain bacteria have developed the ability to alter the normal target binding sites of antibiotics, thereby effectively inhibiting the drug to act on the infectious agent. Next slide. This is an example of mechanisms of the drug resistance. So first, the target site of penicillin on the bacteria cell is a structure called penicillin binding protein or PBF. PBF. No, PBP. Sorry. Second, Streptococcus. Ang hirap niya bigkasin, be. So, basahin niyo na lang. Okay po.
Overproduction or bypass of target enzyme. One of the mechanisms developed by bacteria is targeting specific enzymes that are essential to the metabolism of the organism. This is true in the case of antimicrobials that function as antimetabolites. One way by which this is achieved is by overproduction of the target enzyme of bacteria. By overproducing the target enzyme of the antibiotic, there will still be enough of the enzyme that is free from the antibiotic, allowing the organism to still carry out the essential enzymatic reaction. Some bacteria have developed alternative or bypass mechanisms that can serve as alternatives for the target enzyme. Both these mechanisms are involved in bacterial resistance to sulfonamides. For the next slide, let's talk about the target mimicry. The target mimicry is a new mechanism of antimicrobial resistance that has been discovered. It involves bacteria producing proteins that are similar in structure to the target sites of the antibiotics. Due to the similarity in structure of the new proteins and the target proteins, the antimicrobial binds the new proteins and not the target protein. For instance, the organism Mycobacterium tuberculosis produces a protein that can be mistaken for the structure of DNA. The protein selectively binds fluoroquinolones, preventing its binding to the organism's DNA, making the organism resistant to the drug. For the next slide, it's all about the efflux pump, block penetration, inactivation enzymes, and the target modification. To further understand this, let's take a look on the last slide, which is the summary of mechanisms of antibiotic resistance by bacteria.
So that's all for today. Thank you for your time and listening. Stay safe and have a great day ahead.